Good morning, afternoon, evening, whenever you're watching this or joining me. We are now moving into the endocrine system. So we just finished a unit on the urinary and fluid balance. And as we head towards the end of the semester, because we're almost there, we have the endocrine system. And then our last lecture chapter is the reproductive system. Usually if we are meeting in person, I'm reminding you that we're close to the end. We're so close. But you can't take your foot off the accelerator just yet. So we have 2 more lecture chapters. You have 1 more lecture exam. Some of you, if you're listening to this, check your syllabus for details or announcements on Blackboard for details. And we have the final exam. So bear with us. We're almost there. Okay. The endocrine system. This will probably take 2 videos. The first half is what I want to get through in this video, and that is just introducing the endocrine system, what parts make it up, and how it works. The second half of this chapter will be dealing with the specific hormones themselves. So we'll talk about the different glands, what hormones they release, and what those hormones do. It's very straightforward. But today's the intro. All right, here we go. So here's going to be our outline. I do want to start off this chapter. Sometimes I think the endocrine system gets an unfair shake. Because our glands are spread all throughout our body, it's not like as easy to maybe comprehend altogether as it is, say, the respiratory or cardiovascular or digestive systems. Because those you can just see, this leads to this, this leads to this, this leads to that. And here's what it does. But the endocrine system is structured differently. We've got glands all throughout the body that don't directly lead from one to the other. But I don't want that to underscore the importance of this system. You know it because pretty much every chapter we've covered in A&P 2, when we've gotten to the part of the chapter about how is this body system regulated? Well, we focus on 2 regulatory systems, the nervous system and the endocrine system. So this system is huge because these hormones play an absolutely huge role in regulating our body systems. Also, as a side note, I studied hormones for my dissertation, so I am developing a bit of a love for the endocrine system. So watch out. Okay, here we go. Let's just start with the basics. What color shall we choose for this chapter? How about orange? Let's do orange. Okay. Make sure you review the functions. Really, the regulatory system is a regulating system. I just got done saying it. What 2 body systems oversee our body? Nervous system and endocrine system. The nervous and endocrine systems are just different in how they do it. You know this. Think back to A&P 1. I know you don't want to, but come on, bear with me. A&P 1, we discussed the nervous system. How does it oversee the body? The nervous system communicates through nerve impulses. The nervous system has one master control center, which is the brain. Setting that aside, the endocrine system is different. We have glands spread all throughout the body, and instead of nerve impulses, the endocrine system is going to communicate to the body through hormones. And there will be other differences as well. But I'm going to take you through all of it. You know it. Okay, let's talk about structurally. What is the endocrine system composed of structurally? Well, it's composed of some glands. We do have 2 types of glands, which we're going to talk about. But we have glands spread all throughout the body. Some are in the brain, some are in the throat, some are above the heart, some are in the pancreas. Pancreas is a gland also. Some are on top of the kidney, and some are in our sexual organs. So we have the glands. We have the hormones those glands release. And then we have the target cells. which are where the hormones go to have their action. For example, everyone is familiar usually with growth hormone. It is released from the anterior pituitary gland, circulates in the bloodstream. What would the target cells be for growth hormone? Well, the target cells, in other words, where does growth hormone go to have its actions? The target cells would be primarily muscles and bones. What is the target organ of testosterone? That's a hormone, carried much more prevalently in men than women, although women have some. What are the target organs or target cells of testosterone? Well, it could be the sexual organs, but also could be muscles. What we're going to find out is that pretty much every cell in our body ends up being a target cell. Because every cell in our body is going to be responsive to hormones. So it turns out every cell in our body is going to be a target cell to some hormone. But when we go through the specific glands and hormones, we'll get a sense of what is a specific target cell for each particular hormone. All right, are you with me? Okay, now, this is a bit of a throwback. So it's kind of input here in a weird way, but there's really no other place to talk about it. So let's just break for a moment and let's just talk overall. So we're not really thinking necessarily just about the endocrine system. But what if I'm talking about overall, in all of the body, what are ways in which cells can talk to each other? Okay, so not just hormones in the endocrine system. Overall, the whole body, what are ways in which cells can communicate to each other? That's a pretty important function. You know, we have these cells that are working to try and keep our body going. It's so complicated. We have external, internal conditions changing all the time. So we've got to worry about maintaining homeostasis. So the ability for cells to talk to each other is paramount. So there are three ways in which cells, for the most part, can talk to each other. They can talk through gap junctions, they can talk through local or paracrine hormones, and they can talk through what we would consider a traditional hormone. So let's go one by one. The gap junctions we already talked about. So one way that cells can communicate to each other is through a gap junction. Examples of this would be cardiac muscle cells and certain epithelial cells. Let me go to the next slide here to see what examples they give, just to make sure. Okay, this gives us a nice picture though. A gap junction means that cells have to be side by side, and they literally communicate to each other, as these arrows represent, through gaps. The example we gave up above was the cardiac muscle. So cardiac muscle, bad drawing up ahead, watch out. Cardiac muscle is striated, right? But the unique feature of cardiac muscle is it has those intercalated discs. Every so often there was a thicker band. And what we can see here, and if you remember, you may not, but if you remember from the histology, the cardiac muscle had a little bit more space between the muscle fibers versus skeletal muscle. Skeletal muscle, the fibers were right on top of each other. They were directly, there was no space in between them. But in cardiac muscle, there's a space. And that space, ladies and gentlemen, is a gap. So what that allows is for, in this case in the cardiac muscle, ions can travel through that gap to communicate from one region of the muscle to another. Okay, I'm going to erase that because I'm probably going to draw more. Let me see if I can figure this out. There we go. So what you should be reviewing here, be pretty general, all right? One way that cells can communicate to each other is through gap junctions. An example would be cardiac muscle. And in gap junctions, the cell must be beside each other. So we must have one cell that's pretty close to another cell. So it's only a local communication. Ions, for example, can travel to the cell right next to it to communicate. All right, another example of a way that cells can communicate to each other is through paracrine or local hormones. These are a little bit different from the hormones that we otherwise tend to think of, because that's our third way that cells can communicate to each other. And let's use this table here, because I think it does a reasonable job. So our one way that cells can communicate to each other is through gap junctions, and the cells pretty much have to be side by side. Another way that cells can communicate is through paracrine or local hormones. And the third way that cells can communicate to each other is through our traditional hormone, for lack of a better term. And let's work our way backwards. Let's start with the traditional hormones. These are what you think of. So most hormones are traditional hormones. I gave you the example of growth hormone. This is an easy way for us to visualize how cells communicate in a traditional hormone kind of way. We have the glands, and the glands release their hormones into the bloodstream. And then that bloodstream carries the hormones all throughout the body. So in a traditional hormone, these hormones can travel long distances. So that's why it says through the circulatory system, and the hormones can travel long distances. And this is our example of the growth hormone. I said it was produced in the anterior pituitary gland, which is in the brain. So here we have a hormone produced in the brain that is dumped into the bloodstream, and then that hormone travels through the bloodstream and has effects at all the muscles and bones, all the way to your pinky toe. So it travels through the bloodstream, and it can have effects all throughout the body. That's different from a paracrine or local hormone. In a paracrine or local hormone, the glands release their hormones, but those hormones only travel locally. So instead of traveling long distances, these local hormones travel to nearby tissues. They can travel a greater distance than the gap junctions, which can only really travel to the neighboring cell. But a local hormone cannot travel as long as our traditional hormone that can travel all throughout the body. Let me go back up and think of some examples. Probably some of the best examples would be prostaglandins. We'll talk about these later. But when you think of an example of a local hormone, let's have that be our example. And we're going to talk about those more later. But let that be an example. So we've given an example of each one. An example of direct communication was cardiac muscle cells. Our example of a local hormone would be prostaglandins. And our example of a traditional hormone, which is what most of our hormones are, by the way, but an easy example for now would be growth hormone. Okay, good. Some odds and ends to get into here before we talk about the specific parts of the endocrine system. But because the endocrine system and the nervous system share so many functions, it is worthwhile for us to compare and contrast. You know me, even if we're doing this remotely, damn sure I'm going to have some comparison tables here, some side by side. So let's compare and contrast the endocrine and nervous system. This is a really important slide. We know that they share a function. And if I ask you this question, Please say it out loud, right into the computer or wherever you are, your phone. What is the shared function of the endocrine and nervous systems? I almost gave you the answer. The shared function is that both of these systems regulate body functions. But you knew that. You were saying it out loud. So here are the comparison and contrast. So we talked about one of them. The endocrine system communicates through hormones, whereas the nervous system communicates primarily through nerve impulses. And if we know that, we know a lot about the other differences. A nerve impulse travels fast. However, the effects of a nerve impulse are relatively short-lasting. We send a nerve impulse, we got to go through all those steps. Remember, open sodium channels to depolarize the membrane, which initiates a spark. And then if we depolarize adjacent parts of a cell membrane down the axon, we continue that spark. Nerve impulses are generated quickly, but they only last for a short time. If I want to have a continued effect, I've got to send continual nerve impulses. Compared to the endocrine system, the nervous system has relatively localized effects. Granted, a nerve impulse can go from the grain to your pinky toe, but it's only traveling along one axon at a time. And that one axon at a time only goes to one specific spot. That's what I'm saying locally. Each individual nerve impulse only goes to one specific spot. Let's now move over to the endocrine system, because hormones work very differently. Hormones work a little slowly, more slowly. Why? Hormones have to be released into the bloodstream, and then we have to wait for that bloodstream to be pumped throughout the body. It takes longer than a nerve impulse. So oftentimes the nerve impulse or the nervous system is our quick regulator versus the endocrine, which we have to wait longer to get the effects of. However, once a hormone gets to a target tissue, it tends to have more prolonged responses. A nerve impulse gets somewhere quickly, and for an example, it can contract a muscle, and then it's done. Nerve impulse gets there, contraction, done. Versus an endocrine system. Think about the growth hormone. It takes longer to get to the muscles, but once it gets there, it can result in growth of that muscle for hours or days. So even though the endocrine system works more slowly, once these hormones get to their target cells, the effect is usually much more prolonged. And lastly, the effects of hormones in the endocrine system are more widespread. As I said before, a nerve impulse, each axon only goes to one particular spot. But think about growth hormone. Once we get growth hormone into the bloodstream, it can go pretty much anywhere to all the muscles and bones, so much more widespread. There's a spot for both of these in our body, but together we get the best of both worlds. We're able to regulate quickly and over the long term, and between the two of them, cover all of our bases for what we need for regulation. See? Good slide, huh? This is a picture that I like because it demonstrates the differences. So if you're visual, you might like this. The nervous system is going to communicate through nerve impulses, whereas the endocrine system, for the most part, communicates through hormones. The nerve impulses and hormones act differently. Nerve impulses are quicker, quick to travel down an axon, but they work more locally, can only affect a few target cells at a time, and the effects are shorter lasting. We can see in the bottom picture, hormones circulate in the bloodstream. So because these hormones circulate in the bloodstream, they can have more widespread effects. Look at what happens when these hormones, the little green dots are the hormones, Look at what happens when these hormones get to the target cells. Because of the capillaries, the effect is much more widespread, and it does tend to be longer lasting. Good stuff. Okay. This is more of just like a couple things on the side to point out, so you don't have to necessarily memorize. Well, I know for a fact you don't have to memorize everything on this slide. But there's a couple little points I want to point out, just so you know that these things exist. There are circumstances where a certain chemical can actually function as both a hormone and a neurotransmitter within the nervous system. So remember, hormones, we're thinking of endocrine, because the hormones function in the endocrine system. Neurotransmitters, as the name suggests, function within the nervous system. Well, guess what? There's some chemicals, particularly norepinephrine. Norepinephrine and epinephrine can be both neurotransmitters and hormones. Boom, how about that? I'm not going to go into more detail, but I just want you to know that exists, because we talked about norepinephrine already as a neurotransmitter when we talked about the autonomic nervous system in AMP1. Here I go again, going back to AMP1. Can't forget it. So norepinephrine is a neurotransmitter within the autonomic nervous system. It's one of our fight or flight things. That's why it can act so quickly, because it's a neurotransmitter. But what we're going to find out in this chapter is the adrenal gland, the adrenal medulla, the inner part of the adrenal gland releases norepinephrine and epinephrine as a category of hormones called catecholamines. So therefore, norepinephrine can have a short effect as a neurotransmitter and can also have a long-lasting effect as a hormone, a catecholamine. I mean, pardon my language, but that's pretty badass. Okay. I want to point out that the target cells are going to receive communication from both. So in other words, the cells in your body are going to receive input from nerve impulses. Think about muscles. Muscles as a target cell, muscles are going to receive input from nerve impulses, because if muscles get an input from a nerve impulse, they're going to contract. And muscles also get input from hormones, such as growth hormone. So in that way, oftentimes there are overlapping effects. So I'm just trying to set the stage here. Our cells are going to be open to communication from both, and we rely on these overlapping effects. Last thing I want to point out here, and it's not a huge thing, but sometimes one of the systems regulates the other. So sometimes you can have a neuron that leads to a release of a hormone. So that would be an example of the nervous system regulating the endocrine system. But I'm not going to ask that on a question. It's just more of a point to make, because I like to make points, apparently. Okay. Now, there's one big difference between the nervous and the endocrine systems. You probably picked up on it by now. The nervous system has one master control center, and that is the brain, right? The nervous system has one control center at the top, oversees everything, isn't it nice and organized? Well, the endocrine system doesn't have a similar control center, because these glands are spread all throughout the body, and there's not one master control center that oversees them all. And that can be a little bit hard to understand sometimes. But don't worry, because the endocrine system still works just fine. Pardon me. This system works just fine. It just works differently. What I want to point out is, in the absence of one master control center, so we know that to be true, endocrine system doesn't have a brain overseeing everything. The hypothalamus, if I was to pick a gland that had the most control over the endocrine system, I would choose the hypothalamus. So be careful with this. Listen to what I'm saying. The hypothalamus, it has the most control over glands. What we're going to find out is the hypothalamus oversees the pituitary glands. And the pituitary glands, the anterior and posterior, they secrete the most hormones out of any glands. So just by nature of that, the hypothalamus tends to influence the most glands. So in some way, we can say that it has some level of endocrine control. But it is not a master control center that oversees everything. So it has the most influence over glands, the hypothalamus does, but it is not a master control center like the brain is for the nervous system. All right. What I want to do is I want to talk about how, in a really broad sense, like really 100,000 million feet view, I'm going to talk a little bit about how the endocrine system works. And it shouldn't come as a surprise. We really rely on a negative feedback reflex loop. It's really no different than any other regulatory system in our body. There's a reflexive action that functions like a negative feedback loop. So glands tend to operate like pretty much every other organ in terms of how they know when to act. Let me just see what I have. Okay, we're going to skip that slide, but let's just give an example. Okay, so let's just give an example of a negative feedback loop, and maybe I'll choose a different color just to be fun. Let's do blue. Okay, so let's talk about muscles. I guess I do tend to go to muscles a lot, but it's just my happy place. So, and then we'll say up here we'll have the brain. Oh dear, I'm going to try and draw a brain, but that's a really bad brain. Look at that brain stem. Oh, the fun doesn't end with the bad drawings, does it? And at the bottom of the brain, let me change colors so you can see it. Let's go back to orange. We have the pituitary gland. So we're going to do a little key. P equals, in this case, we're talking about the anterior pituitary gland. All right. And then over top of the pituitary gland would be the hypothalamus. So H for hypothalamus. It's kind of hard to see there. Ooh. All right, let me get back to the blue. And actually, I'm going to go grab a tissue from the other room. I'm so sorry, but I'm just going to pause for 1 second. Hold on. All right. Sorry about that, everyone. Okay, so what's an example of a negative feedback loop here? What if we have a situation where you just exercised, and after exercise, you have a lot of muscle breakdown? So this would be our change from normal. If we were talking about homeostasis, the change from normal would be we have a muscle breakdown. So what's going to happen? There's going to be a negative feedback loop. So our initial trigger is that there's muscle breakdown. And we're going to have some messages being sent up to the brain, hypothalamus, about that muscle breakdown. The hypothalamus is going to oversee that and say, wait a minute, we've got muscle breakdown. That's not good. What are we going to do about it? Well, hypothalamus is going to respond by releasing growth hormone from the pituitary gland to the muscles. And that growth hormone goes to the muscles, and it's going to build that muscle back up. So it's an example of negative feedback. There's some kind of change from normal at some part in the body. In this case, the example I'm giving is there's muscle breakdown. That trigger has to be communicated to somewhere else in the body. In this example, it just so happens to be the hypothalamus in the brain, but other times it can be other organs. It doesn't have to be in the brain. And the hypothalamus is going to realize, oh, muscle breakdown, bad. How are we going to fix it? So, as a means of bringing things back to normal, remember a negative feedback is something is abnormal. We respond by doing the opposite to bring it back to normal. So the hypothalamus is going to respond by triggering release of growth hormone from the anterior pituitary gland, which then goes to the muscles and builds it back up. Negative feedback. So just imagine this kind of loop as happening all throughout the body in all the glands and all the target cells. I'm going to skip these slides. It gives another example, but I think it's a little bit overly complicated. So that's why I prefer to give a simpler example. All right. So the rest of this first video, we're going to be going through the anatomy. What are the glands? What are the kinds of glands? What is a hormone? More importantly, what are the specific types of hormones? How is each type of hormone transported in the bloodstream? And how does each type of hormone have an effect at its target cell? That's the fun stuff. Okay, so let's talk about the glands. As we said already, we have glands all throughout the body. So the glands, they're specialized organs that release hormones. We're going to be discussing 9 glands, all the way from the brain, the pineal gland, hypothalamus, pituitary glands, all the way down to the ovaries and testes. So a gland, specialized organ that releases hormones. There are 2 types of glands. The more common type of gland is the endocrine gland. When we say endocrine, that means that hormones are released into the bloodstream. Okay, so in any endocrine gland, the hormones are released into the bloodstream. That was what I gave the example with for growth hormone. So the anterior pituitary gland produces growth hormone, releases it into the bloodstream. That makes the anterior pituitary gland an endocrine gland. We also, and really our only example of this is going to be the pancreas. We also have an example of an exocrine gland. And in an exocrine gland, instead of the hormones being released into the bloodstream, the hormones are being released into a duct. Hormones are released into a duct. Not a cute little duck baby like we have this springtime. Oh, it's that time of year. But a duct. We know what the duct would be in the pancreas, the main pancreatic duct. So in an exocrine gland, the hormones are released into a duct. And the duct will eventually empty into the bloodstream. But what we're saying is hormones are not directly released into the bloodstream. Instead, in an exocrine gland, like the pancreas, hormones are released into a duct. And that duct will eventually dump the hormones in the bloodstream. So that means that we know insulin and glucagon, the primary hormones released from the pancreas. This means that insulin and glucagon are released into a duct, the main pancreatic duct, which will eventually lead into the bloodstream. Keep it simple, folks. All right, let's talk about hormones. Let me go back. Okay, so we said the anatomy. We know what the glands are now. Glands release hormones. What are hormones? They're chemical messengers. Keep it simple. Hormones are chemical messengers. And each different hormone will communicate a different message. Growth hormone communicates the message to muscles and bones to grow. Norepinephrine and epinephrine releases a chemical message to dilate certain blood vessels. Testosterone releases a message or communicates a message to the testes to produce sperm. Okay, so hormones are chemical messengers. But of course, that is not enough to know. We've got to know more. We're going to talk about 3 categories of hormones: peptide hormones, monoamine hormones, and steroid hormones. Okay, so we know that hormones are chemical messengers, and structurally, there's 3 main types. We have peptide hormones. This is probably the most common. So most hormones that you think of are probably peptide hormones. And as the name suggests, I know you're thinking about it because we know what kind of chemical bonds join amino acids. I have my ear to the screen. You can't see it, but I have my ear to the screen because I want to hear you say it. What kind of chemical bonds join amino acids? Peptide bonds. Oh, it all comes together. So peptide hormones are therefore made up of amino acids. And they tend to be very long amino acid chains. Some examples here on the right. Insulin is a peptide hormone. Angiotensin 2, which we've talked about, part of the renin-angiotensin mechanism to regulate blood pressure and blood volume. Whoa, these are examples of peptide hormones. Structurally, they're long chains of amino acids. That's all we need to know. So peptide hormones, long amino acid chains, most common. We have another category of hormones that are called monoamine, and these are amino acid derivatives. And you can see from this picture on the right, they really don't look like amino acids anymore. They kind of tend to look like carbohydrates in some ways with that hexagon shape. But in any case, we can simply say that monoamine hormones are amino acid derivatives. So they're structurally formed by amino acids, but they're amino acids that join to form a different shape. Examples that I want to say for monoamines are going to be the thyroid hormones and those catecholamines that I mentioned. Catecholamines are the norepinephrine and epinephrine that are released from the adrenal medulla. Okay, so monoamines, a smaller category of hormones that are derived from amino acids, and examples would be the catecholamines and the thyroid hormones. Lastly, we have the steroid hormones. Steroid hormones, as the name suggests, are made up of lipids. And, one reason, there's many reasons why we care about the structure, but one of the big reasons why we care about structure is because how these hormones are formed plays a big role in how they are transported in the blood and how they have their effect at the target cell. So this is important. Okay, our third category of hormones are the steroid hormones or lipid-soluble hormones. They are made up of lipids, and the examples are going to be our steroid hormones, testosterone and estrogen. And if you want to, have a quick look on the right at the structure of steroid hormones. And they look very different from the amino acid ones, the peptide hormones. But look at testosterone and estrogen. Don't they look very similar? Wait a minute. If I look at the right, OH, CH3, they're basically the same. Oh, kind of got a little crazy there. They're kind of the same on the right. My point is, they do have a very similar structure, just with minor differences. If you want to see an example of this, you can look at gynecomastia. So men, For example, if they're taking testosterone exogenously, if they're taking it from a pill or a supplement, they could actually develop gynecomastia. Because they're taking so much testosterone from outside, their body no longer needs its own testosterone, and it will convert its own testosterone into estradiol or estrogen because it's such an easy conversion. And gynecomastia is when like big muscular men develop man boobs. Gynecomastia. Anyway, that's a side thing. Okay, here's a visual if you want to look at the breakdown of hormones. This gets pretty specific, but if we look at it, we have a chemical structure classification. We talked about the amino acid hormones. Oh, hold on, getting myself confused here. We talked about the peptide hormones, which are most common. We talked about the amino acid derivatives, or the monoamine, and then the lipid or steroid hormones. Okay. Now, two big topics to end this first video on. Now that we've established the chemical structure of the different hormones, the peptide, monoamine, and steroid, we're going to talk about two things. One of them, how are these hormones transported in the blood? That's number one. Hormone transport in the blood. And then number two is going to be how these hormones have their effect at the target cells. Okay, so two things. How are hormones transported in the blood? Number one. And number two is, how do these hormones have their effect at the target cell? Okay, what we're going to see is that these three classifications of hormones tend to fall into line based on whether they're water soluble or lipid soluble. So let's start there. The water soluble hormones are the peptide and the monoamine, except for the thyroid. It's always got to be one of those exceptions. Damn it. Apparently I feel like cursing today. I don't know why. I'm sorry. So if it's a monoamine, all except thyroid, we would be including in these monoamines the catecholamines, epinephrine and norepinephrine. Catecholamines. So that's epi and norepinephrine. Not the neurotransmitter, but the hormone. So all of our peptide hormones, which is the biggest category of hormones, all of our peptide hormones are water soluble. And then our monoamine hormones, such as the catecholamines, are also water soluble, with the exception of thyroid hormones. Which means that which classes of hormones are lipid soluble? Our steroid hormones, estrogen, testosterone, and the thyroid hormones. So I would start there in trying to comprehend what we're going to talk about here. Which of those three categories of hormones are water soluble? And which of those three categories of hormones are lipid or fat soluble? Good. So then we know how they're transported because we know the blood is 55% water. So if a hormone is water soluble, then these hormones can dissolve in the bloodstream. Simple. They're hydrophilic. They like water. So the peptide and the catecholamine hormones, they dissolve in the bloodstream. Which means that they can be transported easily in the blood. No big deal. These hormones are dumped into the bloodstream and they don't need any special care. They can just travel in the bloodstream, off they go. It is a different case, however, for our steroid and thyroid hormones. Because these hormones are lipid soluble, they cannot dissolve in the blood. They're hydrophobic. So they're a little bit trickier. If we just tried to dump these steroid hormones into the blood, it's like oil and water. They don't mix. So therefore, they require some special care. These steroid hormones require a transport protein. They need a little transporter. All right. I'm going to move ahead to a picture, and then we're going to come back. So this picture I actually really like. I know. So let's look about transport. If we look at the bloodstream, let's review that we're talking about the water-soluble hormones and the lipid-soluble hormones. We could say that the yellow squares are the water-soluble hormones, which of course is the peptide hormones and the monoamines except for the thyroid. And why am I saying that? Because they're being transported in the blood as they are. They don't need a carrier. Now, what if I look at some of the blue triangles? In this picture, the blue triangles would represent the lipid-soluble hormones, because they need a transport protein, which is the green guy. So check it out. In the bloodstream, the water-soluble hormones can just exist as they are. It's great. Versus the blue triangles, which are the lipid-soluble hormones, they require a transport protein. I'm going to erase these because I'm going to use this slide again to talk about how these interact with the target cell. But feel free to take a screenshot or pause it if needed. Okay. Good. Winding down here. It's been a really cloudy spring, hasn't it? I guess that means it's more time to study, but it's kind of hard, especially when we're quarantined, the majority of us. It can be hard to stay motivated, isn't it? I certainly understand. Okay, so one of our topics was how are these hormones transported in the bloodstream? Good. Our second consideration, how do these hormones influence or communicate with the target cell? How do these hormones communicate with the target cell? Again, it breaks down along water-soluble versus lipid-soluble lines. This time, we're going to start with the lipid-soluble hormones. Guess what? The lipid-soluble hormones can communicate directly to receptors inside the target cell. Amazing. And why is that? That's the case because think of our cell membrane. What is our cell membrane made up of? Remember our cell membrane? It's got the phospholipid bilayer. So our cell membrane is made up of lipids. A cell membrane is made up of lipids. So if it's a lipid-soluble hormone, then those hormones that are lipid-soluble can just scoot right through. Great. Love it. Whereas the water-soluble hormones, these hormones are water-soluble, which means that they can be transported in the blood easily because they're water-soluble. But once they get to that target cell, which is made up of lipids, right? Target cell, the target cell membrane made up of lipids. It's kind of a funky cell membrane there. These water-soluble hormones cannot go straight through because they're not lipid-soluble, they're water-soluble. So because of that, these water-soluble hormones require a messenger. And we're going to give an example of that in a little bit. Typically, that messenger involves G proteins and intracellular second messengers. So what this means is we have a receptor on the cell membrane surface. And instead of it just being one step, The lipid-soluble hormones, it's just one step. They just move right into the cell and do their thing. But the water-soluble hormones, if this is a receptor, the water-soluble hormones have to interact with this receptor first. And then only after the water-soluble hormone has interacted with that receptor, only then can it trigger a second messenger inside. And that second messenger will eventually have the influence inside of the cell. So it's a two-step process. Let's go to the picture. So you see, water and lipid-soluble hormones have it easier or harder in some instances. If I look at the bloodstream, it was almost easier for the water-soluble hormones. They could just circulate freely. But it was more difficult for the lipid-soluble hormones because they needed a transport protein. But it switches when we get to the target cell. At the target cell, the lipid-soluble hormone, excuse me, the lipid-soluble hormone is able to be released from its transporter protein and just move right into the cell. It's one step, easy. But the water-soluble hormone, it will leave the bloodstream, but it has to first interact with a receptor on the outside of the cell membrane. Because it's water soluble, it cannot simply dissolve through the cell membrane that is made up of lipids. And then it will initiate a series of chemical reactions on the inside of the cell called a chemical messenger. This is a pretty global breakdown, so it's a pretty general breakdown, but I think it really outlines the differences. And even though we can get into more specifics of this and that, I think understanding this gives you a really good handle, gives you a really good basis of understanding the endocrine system. Okay, before we go on, I want to talk a little bit about some of these receptors. And I want to talk about receptors both in the bloodstream, or excuse me, let me backtrack that. I want to talk about receptors. Let me change colors for our receptor discussion. What color am I going to be able to see inside of that? How about black? Okay. I want to talk about receptors in the cell membrane, which is this guy, right? And receptors inside the target cell. So because of the differences between water and lipid-soluble hormones, we have to discuss receptors that exist in the cell membrane and receptors that exist inside the cell. Okay. In both cases, whether it's a receptor in the cell membrane or whether it's a receptor inside of the cell, in both cases, receptors show specificity. So just like we talked about with enzymes, if you remember, each enzyme can only bind to a specific substrate. So for example, amylase can only work with starch. Protease can only work with protein. Well, there's a similar specificity here. A lipid-soluble hormone is only going to be able to attach to a specific receptor. Let's say I'm talking about testosterone. If this hormone was testosterone, it could only bind to a testosterone receptor. If this testosterone hormone tried to bind to an estrogen receptor, it wouldn't work. So these receptors are specific to the hormone. A second point to make is that no matter if the hormone is binding to a receptor in the cell membrane, or no matter if the hormone is binding to a receptor inside the cell, every hormone has to bind to a receptor to have its effect. That's the only way it's going to work. It just may differ as to where that receptor is. But every hormone has to bind to a receptor to have its effect. Okay. Now, here's an example, and we are not going to get that specific with this, which is okay with me because the specifics are not really important to our discussion right now. But we're talking about water-soluble hormones. We know that water-soluble hormones can be transported on their own in the bloodstream, but we know that because they're water-soluble, once they go to try and interact with a cell, they cannot go directly into the cell through the cell membrane because that cell membrane is made up of lipids, and these are water-soluble. So as we said, we have to have a two-part system. So I just want to give you an example. The first messenger would be step number 1. That's all I want to say. And the second messenger, so far all I want to say, the second messenger is what's activated inside the cell. So we tend to use these terms, and all we mean is, if we're talking about a first messenger system, we're talking about that hormone, that water-soluble hormone, binding to a receptor on the cell membrane surface. And then, only after we've done the first messenger, do we activate a second messenger system. And the second messenger system is inside of the target cell. You can see at the bottom here, these abide by a principle of amplification, which just means that a small number of first messengers can actually activate a larger number of second messengers, which is a great thing. It means that we can really amplify or really bump up the influence of the hormone. I want to give an example of some second messengers. And the only reason I'm bringing this up, one of the main reasons I'm bringing it up is because a lot of prescription drugs target this second messenger system. And it often targets these G proteins, which are a part of the second messenger. So just like we talked about in AMP1, a lot of prescription drugs tend to have their effect at neurotransmitters. If we know the effect of a certain neurotransmitter, we can deliver a drug to block the receptor for that neurotransmitter to lessen its effects, or we can deliver a drug to open more receptors for that neurotransmitter if we want to increase the effect of that neurotransmitter. So we can manipulate these receptors. But not only for neurotransmitters, we can also manipulate these receptors for hormones by either opening up more or less receptors or activity of these G proteins. Because if we know the effect of a hormone and we want to either enhance that effect or inhibit that effect, we can do so by a chemical drug that either blocks or opens its receptor. And I have a picture, not that you have to know all these steps because you don't. Listen to me, I'm going to be shouting through the computer screen. You don't have to know all these steps. But this is a good visual of a second messenger system. Let's look here. And I want to go back down here. I didn't realize it was going to go up there. Okay, I'm going to switch back to the black color. Let's look at hormone B. So they're showing you a water-soluble hormone as an orange triangle. So here we have a water-soluble hormone. That water-soluble hormone can be transported in the blood on its own. But once it gets to the target cell, and look at this up-close look at the target cell membrane. A cell membrane is made up of a phospholipid bilayer. Check it out. So this is water-soluble, so it cannot go through the lipid-soluble membrane. So it has to bind to a receptor. And that's what the first step is, or the first messenger. Hormone, the water-soluble hormone, binds to a matching receptor. Then, all the activity happening inside of the cell is part of our second messenger system. And as I mentioned before, a lot of these second messenger systems rely on G proteins. You've heard me say this many times throughout the semester. I'm going to say it again. There is a chemical reaction cascade. So after we have the first messenger, where the water-soluble hormone binds to the receptor on the outside of the cell membrane, that will initiate a second messenger system, which is a series of chemical reactions. This chemical reaction leads to this one, leads to this one, and so forth. It does involve G proteins. Eventually, the second messenger series of chemical reactions is going to activate something called cyclic AMP. You don't need to know that. And the cyclic AMP is going to convert an inactive protein enzyme to an active one. So we basically have these protein enzymes just hanging out, and these protein enzymes hanging out are inactive until they get this message from the second messenger system. All right. You don't need to know all the details, just pointing out first messenger and second messenger system. Just pointing out that the second messenger system involves G proteins that a lot of drugs can manipulate, and that the second messenger system is a series of chemical reactions that ultimately convert an inactive protein enzyme to an active one. Deep breath, everyone, deep breath. We are almost done with the first part of this video. Oh yes, we got 2 more slides. Okay. Oh my God, this is a big moment. We've come all this far. Big moment. The ultimate effect of a hormone is to either inhibit or activate an enzyme. That is it. A hormone either activates an enzyme or inhibits it. In the example we gave up in here, in this water-soluble hormone, this was an example of a water-soluble hormone that activated an enzyme. But it could also happen that the protein enzyme is active and only becomes inactive when the hormone gets to it. But check it out. It's not like these hormones deliver a detailed voicemail. So it's not like growth hormone. Growth hormone doesn't go to the muscles and say, please leave a message, beep. Hi, this is growth hormone. I'd like you to increase growth for the next 2 hours at a rate of this speed for this long. Have a nice day. Bye. It's not as fun or funny if I'm doing it to myself, but okay. But the point is, a hormone is not a complicated message. Because let's face it, these are just chemicals. They aren't capable of being like we are. We can talk forever and leave these long messages. Instead, a hormone goes to a target cell and either activates the target cell or inhibits the target cell. What do you think growth hormone? What is the effect of growth hormone going to be on muscles and bones? Yep, you got it. Growth hormone is going to activate the muscle. Activate anabolic reactions within the muscle to build more muscle. Other hormones can be inhibitory. If we talk about the catecholamines, epinephrine, norepinephrine. Epinephrine, norepinephrine, when these hormones reach the kidneys, their effect is inhibitory. So they actually inhibit enzymes within that target cell. And of course, by either activating or inhibiting enzymes, we're changing that cell's metabolic rate. Okay, last thing I want to say here. When a hormone gets to a target cell, it doesn't activate or inhibit the target cell to do something different from what it usually does. A hormone goes to a target cell, activates or inhibits what it's already doing. So when I gave the example of muscle cells, muscle cells are specialized to do muscle cell stuff. So muscle cells can contract, and then they can rebuild or break down, pretty much. So when growth hormone goes to a muscle, it activates the muscle cell to do more of what it already can do. Testosterone. I was trying to think of another example that would be simple. That's what the pause was. Testosterone goes to the testes in males, and it activates the testes. And when you activate the testes, they're going to be doing more of what they already do, which is to produce sperm. Okay, so if we were to really think about these hormones, once they get to a target cell, what are they doing? We know how they travel in the bloodstream. We know how these hormones get into the cell. But once that hormone binds to a receptor inside the target cell, it's either going to activate or inhibit that cell through activating or inhibiting enzymes. It's almost like a red light, green light. If I'm talking about hormones that activate target cells, it's like giving the target cell a green light to go do more of what it's already doing, versus some cells that can be inhibitory, some hormones that can be inhibitory. When norepinephrine and epinephrine go to the kidneys as a hormone, they inhibit enzymes, which is almost like giving the red light to that target cell to inhibit it for a period of time. This is a huge point. It's not like hormones deliver a complicated message. They either activate enzymes to activate the cell to do more of what it's already doing, or a hormone inhibits enzymes which inhibit the cell to put a red light on that cell to stop or slow down what it's doing. Okay, last point before we end this first video. I just want to point out that hormone signals must be turned off. And that's why I like the green light, red light analogy. If I send something that activates a target cell, I'm going to have to send something else to inhibit the target cell. Otherwise, the green light stays on. So if I have a hormone that excites a target cell, that's like giving it the green light. Whenever I want to slow down or stop that target cell, I've got to deliver another hormone to give it the red light. The rest here is all extra. We are going to pick up with this in our second video, which is more straightforward, just going through the hormones and glands themselves. All right, great work, everyone. See you soon. Oh, I'm still recording and I can't figure out how to turn this thing off. There we go. All right, see you soon.